Okay, so let's just roll. Besides talking about that process diagram, are there any other agenda items people would like to bring on to the table? I'll drop a link to the document in the chat. Okay, so there's just the Google Doc, and then the diagram. I'll just or Trini, do you want to screen share the diagram as we talk through it?
Yeah.
Basically, we had one discussion session with some USDA ARS input, and we started mulling around the whole mechanical process and fractionation area. So that's led to some changes in that diagram. Maybe first we just discuss the top level of the diagram and then into the fractionation questions, which engendered some interesting input from those folks, which I hope to see you guys saying yay or nay on.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I think it was such a long discussion that we didn't really reach any conclusions, but they brought up all the right questions that we should be answering. And we started out with something really simple. We're looking at the list of certain foods in their database and then determining if they are raw or not. And then we came to a few foods that have been cut into some kind of part of the whole. And that's what brought up this question about if you separate a part of some food from its whole, like egg yolks and egg whites and so on, is it still raw? So just to tell you how we opened that conversation, and there could be other use cases that you might have. So you might find a different perspective on the same topic, and that's great. So here you see this is not at all complete, but if you could just wait until we address the questions, that'd be great. So a mechanical force it's under the subclass of mechanism. So you apply some force to a variety of other processes, which could be pressing a juice or an oil, but we're going to look at the fractionation piece here. So there's a few questions here. Sorry, I'll have to. So first, you see here we've got a subclass right underneath of plant versus animal. Now, one question is whether this classification is necessary here, or somewhere else where you talk about what the origin is. And so then I think there are other subclasses which would be common to both, whether plant or animal, which is separation by boundary. And is this another way of saying anatomical separation? So some examples for you to think about this is, for example, germ endosperm or husk separation, which is a plant, or egg white and egg yolk separation, which is in an animal. And of course, the various animal butchery, which, chicken breast, chicken wing, and so on. So is this anatomical? Is this boundary? And while you're thinking about this, what are the other boundaries? Is there an anatomical separation where there is no boundary? Then there is a phase separation. So milk versus cream, or buttermilk versus butter. Would that be a phase separation, or is that separation by some other property like density? Stop there with the questions, and then we can go on into the other questions, but maybe there's already a lot of comments here.
Mm-hmm. So can we just scroll up to the diagram again? Yeah, so it popped out animal fractioning, this whole word fractioning, separation and fractioning, the relationship between those two words. interesting thing right away in the previous discussion was that animal fractioning could be the separation of milk just as easily as butchery and egg fractioning. So that was, those little use cases immediately popped out underneath animal fractioning as one way to organize these processes.
So I guess, what do you think about the word fractioning or separation? Any comments on the terminology?
Well, about the egg, I think if the separation alters the nutrient profile of a whole food, then we can say that it's not raw anymore because the nutrient profile of the whole egg is changed. If we look at an apple, if we just take the stem out, I don't think the nutrient profile changes. So that would be an example.
Right, but there, I mean, of course, the nutrient profile is going to change, but it's not because there's a chemical reaction. And whereas if you cut into an apple, there's an enzymatic reaction. So there is the change because of that. So how do you, chemical change really needs to be looked at a little bit more. What's the cause of that change? Is it a reaction?
I think to cut an apple. In my example, I meant just little wooden stem at the top.
No, I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying that when you say that, you know, chemical composition is the reason for something being raw, there could be more detail there, whether there needs to be a reaction.
Then it's very hard to draw the line.
Okay.
I think chemical composition is measurable, and it's, you know, you have a good baseline to compare as a foundation of your comparison.
Okay, so next question. Is separation by boundary an anatomical separation? Is it the same thing? Are there boundaries which are not part of anatomy?
Magali? I'm not sure it is obligatory, mandatory the same. I think we have possibly some exceptions. I am thinking of the meat, for example, which can be differently according to the country or to the butcher. So we have to, however, we have to refer to anatomical muscle to describe the meat cut. So I have no answer, but some questions.
It's pretty clear in my mind that the gross anatomy is certainly involved in butchery, but the finer cuts have no anatomical boundaries. Those cross sections of a loin or whatever, there is no anatomical.
Right, they don't have boundaries, but they have to be cut in a certain way. They have to go against the grain. You wouldn't cut in that direction. So I don't know. I mean, that's not really a boundary. It is an anatomical consideration. I'm not saying we should think about that. That's kind of maybe too fine a detail, but it was just a thought.
Right. So not so much anatomical parthood that is yielded by the process, but the navigation of the process involves anatomical reference.
So then another question is separation by other physical properties or phase separation. So milk and cream or butter and buttermilk. Can you think of other examples of separation that are not based on boundary?
What about grain milling?
Grain milling? Yeah, And
Yes.
and there we had actually like this pressing of juice and oil, like not that it's the same thing, but that was more of, I guess that's also another question, is on the kind of force, whereas maybe, cutting is more directed, especially if it's like a boundary separation, whereas a phase separation would be the force would have maybe a different orientation or direction, and the same. So I think that all of these classes below mechanical force should have a parent class which says something about the orientation of the force. And so grinding would be there. But I can put that down and come
And
to the
just
question.
to go further, you refer to mechanical forces, and so we have to think of rheological properties. I mean, the way you measure the force may be by elongation or by compression and so on. So it is almost the same as you say, I think. It is about
Right, the direction of application.
Yes.
Oh. Well, that then gives rise to rheological properties. But I think that those organoleptic properties, there's actually another section here that talks about the objective. So you might apply a certain force for a certain rheological property.
It's on the
but
far right. The diagram.
Yeah.
Organoleptic.
Where here there's like texture. But anyway, we wanted to actually separate those two aspects. And so what you're saying definitely makes sense, but it would be in that section of the ontology to the right.
I was going to say one other thing that's been kind of helpful to me in doing this exercise is to realize that a process, when we conventionally bandy it about, actually can involve several different processes. So that one about cutting an apple and triggering an enzymatic reaction, initially we were thinking, well, that cutting necessarily causes change, but chemical composition change in some kinds of food. But actually the cutting itself doesn't cause that. We can isolate that process out from an enzymatic reaction process that's triggered by the cutting. So I'm seeing now the creation of these dependencies of relations. So happy.
And actually, that's why there is here the enzyme. We've got these molecular reactions, enzyme activation and inactivation, and then these would link here.
Mm-hmm.
The one these process part of would be, that reaction would be part of this process. I guess going back to my earlier question, I mean, it's great to get all these other questions that just spin out of this, but were there any thoughts on separation, phase separation or separation by other properties? I mean, then there's things like extraction, which isn't really separation.
You have also the size. I mean, you have size.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, for filtration.
Right, yeah.
Velocity is important.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Okay.
And what about solvent extraction? Extraction by solvent. It is chemical.
That is chemical, exactly. So there is here this extraction process by mechanism. Here there's modification, and so the extraction would be there. So I think if the, yeah, exactly. So I think this is more physical methods. And yeah, I guess, yeah, we should, although mechanical force is clearly physical, but it would be good to categorize it as physical.
And on that note, can we simplify the name of the modification by addition of chemical or compound? I just put that stuff in red because that's supposed to include ingredients, additives, and substances, but I think we can get rid of the red stuff on that.
Sure.
Can we just say chemical modification? Oh, there's the word addition in there. So chemical addition, modification by chemical addition. I think chemical includes
by chemical, maybe.
Yeah. Do you want to edit that?
Sure.
Yes, because extraction by solvent is not an addition.
Right, exactly. Yeah, saying addition makes it very specific. So,
Or how about chemical Oh, right. No, modification by chemical. Yeah. Okay.
and I can add extraction there later. Just don't want to make a mess of the diagram now. Did you? Sorry, I didn't make that change.
I'll add. Oh, I don't recall me making that change either. Oh, you know what's happened? I did a little bit of an edit and it just timed in with that. Can you redo your edit? Okay, so then mod separation by size, that's a class still for mechanical process. Okay. Then, yeah. Okay. What are the different, what do you think are the different physical or chemical changes that might occur as a result of this separation? Chemical changes could be enzyme activation or oxidation. Physical could be cellular damage.
I'm not sure, but perhaps pressure is causing damage to cell. I don't know if it's your question, but I am.
No, that wasn't my question.
No, okay.
I was wondering, like cell damage is an example of a physical change. So can you think if other, or an example of a chemical change would be oxidation or enzyme activation? Can you think of other physical or chemical changes?
I don't know if this is quite along the thoughts that you're having of this physical change, but I guess I was considering if you're doing something like frothing milk, incorporating air bubbles somehow.
Right, so there was this here, other mechanical force, which is, homogenization is, of course, it covers many things, and this incorporation of air may or may not be a homogenization process. But in general, combining, distributing phases equally is basically oil, water, air. So distributing immiscible phases equally is homogenization. Now, generally, adding air into a liquid, like if you are whipping cream or you're carbonating something, those would be homogenization, even though the air does tend to rise to the top. So if we don't have anything more to say on fractioning, then actually homogenization is another big topic. So I guess one way would be, one opening question is, what is the most general definition you can think of? Is homogenization clear as a term? Does it mean the combination of various immiscible molecules? I mean, and then it could be, emulsification, carbonation. Like if those were, for instance, some subclasses, I think they would fall under homogenization.
And there's an OBO-foundry term, object aggregate, that is probably appropriate here. Homogenization can create a kind of object aggregate or redistribute object aggregate items, basically mixtures. In fact, we might be able to use a Kebi term as the output of homogenization, being a mixture of separable or unattached components.
I'm also wondering whether, if you're thinking this aggregation, because in homogenization, there could be a reversible or an irreversible. And so homogenization of milk is irreversible. And so there you're not just distributing things equally, but you're actually changing the chemical structure so that certain molecules don't flocculate in the way that they would otherwise.
And
or you might be using surfactant, which all does that, keeps things from, flocculating, attaching, come back to its original form.
Food technology around trying to add lifespan to that homogenized substance, right?
Right. So however we put that information here, I think and then it could all still be homogenization. So what I'm trying to see is if this class right on top makes sense, or if we need any more differentiation at that level, or it can be all below that.
So far, it sounds like subclasses of homogenization. What's the relationship between mixing and homogenization? Is mixing somehow more general, or are they about the same? Are they synonyms?
Mixing and homogenization are not the same, I would say. But I was thinking about, I was thinking of centrifugation.
Yes, centrifugation is this here, this milk and cream. So it's an example of.
But, yes, but the process itself isn't on the graph. It's a mechanical process, I mean.
Yeah, I'll pop it in there so we can find a home for it.
Okay. But your question about mixing is very...
But no, I mean, then it could be like stirring and mixing. Could be like, moving a spoon around for 2 seconds. So it's an interesting question, but it's so non-specific that unless we give it a then we can give it a definition and put it there and think of all synonyms as well for it.
Now, I see Larissa Soldatova, you are on the call. If you're listening, I know your laboratory process ontology has put a fair bit of thought into tested out some of that vocabulary. Should we be trying to bring in those terms here into this process diagram?
Sorry, I was a little bit late. So yes, I was listening not from the very beginning, like jumped in the third episode of series, and I was amazed by the depth of the conversation. It's true, we also have centrifugation and mixing, and never went to such deep level of understanding what chemically is happening. We were based just how people using these terms in their practice. So it was purely driven how people operate in laboratory, and we never separated clearly if it's exact synonyms or not, just from description of protocols, both words were frequently used. And so what you are doing here is far more thorough and admirable, but I don't have immediate answers.
Right, okay. Well, one thing that strikes me is that centrifugation or centrifuging is a separation, a fractionation. It must fit under fractionation somewhere.
I think centrifugation has to do with differences in particle size or density. So it is a technique, it is a kind of force that's used when you're separating by physical property.
So I would think it's a subclass of fractioning.
Yes, but I was wanting to add where you have elongation and grinding. If we're going to, and we should, but the direction or the orientation of the force is different from the property of the food by which we are separating. And centrifugation has to do with the direction of the force. It's like a tangential force, right? So it pushes some things out to the side and then something gathers in the center.
So, and is there an opposite to that? Such that we can create a duality and create a superparent class that encompasses the two? If it's useful. If it's not, then we don't bother any further. We just add a good definition like the one you just added to the term and not worry too much about exactly where it's sitting in the hierarchy.
I'm wondering whether, there's two notions here for mechanical force or mechanical process. One is the direction of the force, and then there is the property by which we separate. And those two, even if sometimes now with centrifugation, we are apparently, kind of confounding both of those should be separate, because that's how food engineering is, that the same property can be exploited by different methods of processing.
So pragmatically, if we find that we can distinguish these mechanism processes by that duality you just mentioned, then we should certainly put a class down that captures duality, even if we don't directly attach processes to it, especially if a process happens to have a couple. This touches on one other thing, which is that so far we're doing all this work with ISA relations, class subclass. We're explicitly drawing them on the diagram, but every ontologist wants to see inferred classes. And so it sounds to me like that distinction you just made between the direction of force is possibly something that could allow for inferred subclasses underneath those two. And that means that we're still organizing our processes in primarily semantically according to one ISA scheme, but that we can infer those other ISAs. And in that way, keep people happy who want that a class just has one parent explicitly stated, or even no parents, if we can define the criteria that can then infer where that process fits in a poly hierarchy. I'm in favor of always having at least one explicit ISA hierarchy, just to help humans organize this stuff without having to run a reasoner. But, okay, well, let's table that particular thing, but suffice to say, I'll just try to capture what you said very briefly, and Tarina, then maybe you can elaborate that
Sure.
Mechanical process force by the direction of force is a class or a distinction. We need to elucidate a little bit more. Okay. All right, we're just a little over halfway through. Are there other comments around this particular mechanical process branch?
Can I say just 2 words that came in, but after you switched to the homogenization, slicing and grating, do you think it could be insert here as?
Yes.
Definitely. We have it here actually. And so there's a lot of information in this. It's just not all been like multi-homed. So here there is an extraction here. There is, this has to do with the objective being that you want to cut it into some shape.
Okay.
And so this here would be then multi-homed here. So there's a mechanical force, but the objective, which is what, as you look to the lower classes in this branch, here you want to see something about an end physical organoleptic property. Slicing, so cutting into some shape, here the slicing is an example.
Yeah, so we've got, right, so all of those processes that do something, they are equally valid under the process by mechanism branch, but they are showing up here multi-homed. And maybe this is a prime example of how maybe this process by objective branch could actually be inferred by saying that you're after an objective is a superclass, and then the subclasses get automatically, process subclasses automatically get inferred to be positioned under that. So it could be that this process by objective branch is really skinny, and then most of these subclasses get inferred. And I could try to do a little bit of an experiment to see what that looks like, because the processes themselves, when it gets down to slicing, output sliced food, generic kind of objectives. And so bread slicing would be a subclass of slicing. And if it's the objective to have a sliced something at the end of the slicing process, then there might be an opportunity to marry this stuff together to make an inferred diagram, rather than having to duplicate bread slicing and slicing under both branches.
Damien, just a question. If we consider the process by objective, for example, slicing, you have the desired effect and the undesired. For example, we can take again the example of the apple. You can have the objective to slice the apple, but you have the consequence of enzymatic reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you manage with this complexity?
Yeah. If you were to take the different process model bits and pieces and try to run a reasoner to see how they all fit together, that's a picture that could probably yield the unexpected or undesired enzymatic reaction as an outcome of the slicing process. And you wouldn't have to explicitly state that, it would be inferred. So that sounds like a good opportunity for inference. Of course, owl ontologies aren't particularly bright about time relations. So if the enzymatic process, we would sort of have a snapshot of what processes are implied by what processes if we set up these dependencies. But it wouldn't be calculating time impacts, like the fact that this negative at a feature would only show up an hour, half an hour, or 2 hours later so there wouldn't be a temporal dimension to this, except as maybe side information that you put into a knowledge graph and run swirl calculations on. So, okay, I will try to do a little experiment in that regard to see, because right now it is bothersome to see this process by objective branch and be wondering whether one is supposed to make connections over in the process by mechanism branch too.
Yeah, this is a question we've had for a while. So it's really good to have this example so we can start to tackle this. I think as for the intended and unintended, that almost sounds, the risk there is it could be subjective. But, so for instance, if you're curing olives, you are losing polyphenols, but then you're gaining palatability because it's not so bitter anymore. So what the consequence is. The consequence is reduce bitterness, lose polyphenols. But whether that consequence is intended or unintended, I think of it as important, yes, but another layer of information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so that actually brings up one other thing. So I have tucked into the upper right corner the Obo Foundry little model of processing as just sort of like a cheat card. And this whole diagram only focuses on the blue and then a couple of processes and then a couple of green spots. It doesn't introduce qualities or roles of things or data. But hidden in the OB world, those other components are possible. But what I haven't gotten to is modeling sort of the basic PO2 and exact2 versions of process modeling. But I'd like to put in 2 little cheat cards up in the corner for those 2 as well, just to see at least how they're covering or would connect with relations, what we've got going in the main diagram. So I'll try to get that done for our next telecon. And that way, at least we can see a mapping in and out of the quote Obo Foundry world, but also it would maybe provide a little bit of a groundwork for deciding on what we should ask of Obo Foundry going into the future. COB is this new joint ontology that they're developing to make it easier to borrow pieces from Obo Foundry ontologies by borrowing the common ones. And so all of this process ontology stuff could fit within this new COB ontology directly. But it does rely on RO relation ontology relations at the moment. So if there are new ones we need for the process modeling, then we have to bring them in. But the Obo Foundry folks are going to push for the basics that are in that diagram I pointed out there. Right. I guess the other question is, are there any little process modeling subdomain questions that we need to add to this diagram to upper level in order to make people happy? So, for example, one thing I've really skimmed over is transportation. And yet we're starting to get inquiries about modeling the whole farm to fork journey. And so if processes are the glue between food states all the way through this, then transportation is an example of a part of the diagram that's pretty weak right now. In fact, is the word transportation even mentioned?
Yeah.
It is somewhere over here.
Like
yes,
process by,
right.
Yeah, you have transportation and packaging.
Right. So that's pretty minimal. And yet I know in transportation, there's all this technology around refrigerated trucks. There's storage. I guess we don't even have storage in there. Storing apples for 6 months over the winter. So if that's your area of interest, it would be great to have somebody help model that chunk a bit better. For example, Matthew Lang's group is all about this watershed concept. And I just got another inquiry from some Canadians who are creating GIS maps about food security and food deserts around availability of local food, farm food in Ontario. And they've got a giant database which is all about getting food to people from local producers. So this diagram so far does not really support that very well.
So what I'm trying to, it's even not a question or comment. It looks amazing when you try to put together such high-level processes like transportation and also low-level processes like molecular levels, so cell disruption or giant lorries carrying around. I can only guess what the consequences may be because it's such different levels of granularity. Just maybe think for a while, can it cause some problems or not? Again, I can't even answer it, but I don't think I've ever seen such very, very granular and also high-level processes put together. I don't say it's wrong, but maybe to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually been working a lot. I share that concern because I've been doing a lot of this like objective and mechanism. And what I can say about, but transportation is important, and Damien, I'm sure, can speak more to that because it does change the composition of the food quite a lot. And sometimes there are even efforts to avoid changing the composition of food. So if we want to have, one ontology that describes all the ways that food changes, then if you look here to the left, we've also got these changes that happen without any intention. Things out of flower or ripen or rot anyway. So transportation sort of makes sense from that perspective, that these are changes that happen. Now, as far as then saying that what chemical changes happen as a result of adding, a sprouting inhibitor, because that's a huge concern in storage, is you want to minimize the chemical change as much as possible. So either you avoid that by reducing the temperature, or you introduce another chemical. So for instance, the chemical addition that we were talking about earlier, I'd be really wary of connecting that to this transportation branch. It could be for somebody who's really focused this work and that really wants to think about tracing food from source to destination.
Can I just come in? I was wondering if it is really the transport which are changing the composition, or the temperature and the time of transport.
It's mostly the time. The longer a food spends before in whatever state before it's eaten is a concern. It could be stored, it could be transportation.
So to follow up the comments by Larissa, I mean, I don't think the transportation is a kind of process. What do you think? Yes or no? It is more the time.
Forgive me, I have to jump in on this one. Transportation is a process, and it's a bit of a wild west. So I would say that yes, it is a process. Yes, there are some serious modeling issues to be worried about there. They may not align one-to-one with what we're doing here with the process hierarchy, but there's some serious modeling to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see how transportation can be viewed as geographic relocation of food. And then there's a time cost to that, and there's conditions that relocation must occur under, for example, for optimal food preservation. So tons of modeling, and maybe it's just that we stay away from that, or actually, well, this touches on the generic issue around a number of the processes we've got in this diagram. Transportation can apply to anything. It's just that food has other requirements within that. You can have a trainload of TVs sitting around on a spur for 2 months and it's no problem. But for example, technically, if these processes are all ID'd in Foodon, and about a quarter of them are at the moment, then I'm IDing a process called transportation at the most general level. And I'm giving it a Foodon ID, which makes me feel a little awkward because it's not really, it's a general term that's above Foodon. So there is an opportunity here to create a OboFoundry compatible list of general processes. And I think, Larissa, the transform of your lab ontology has a number of generic processes that fit above all of these more food specific ones. So I'm open to working on that as a side project for this more general terms.
While you're thinking about that, Damien, I'm wondering how you would add a general term for storage. And it could be storage that happens as part of transportation. It could just be storage anyway. And then it has, whatever consequences. Sometimes you want that storage because it actually improves the quality of some organoleptic aspect of the food, So I don't want to get into consequences, but storage as a general term is something to think about.
Yes, it sounds attractive because then you are free from context. And when you need, you can add context what you're actually focusing on.
Right.
For these generic terms, and then develop how you need depending on application or purpose.
If I can jump in with one use case that I think works well with food processing and food transportation. Let's say you're shipping grain from Canada to Eastern Europe. You're using a shipping container, which is a permanent container that's rented to you. So as a container, it's permanent, it exists for many other people, but you have it temporarily. And then the container needs to have an affidavit that it was cleaned by a worker so that you don't have, for example, sawdust in the middle of it when you're trying to put food in it. And then you're going to put a food liner inside the container to move the grain. That grain is going to be filled in with a blower where they physically blow the grain into the container. They zip up the liner, close the container, and then it gets physically shipped to Europe. Now, when it gets to Europe, the liner usually has survived. Sometimes it doesn't, and then you open the gate and about 20 tons of grain decides to move by itself. But usually you unzip the liner, and then they pour the grain into their own bin. So you have the containment, you have transport, you have the container, and you have the state and the process of contamination of whatever you're putting in that container. So I think you can recycle a lot of what is already in the process ontology to do a lot of this.
Okay. Right. Well, I really like this idea of focusing on storage rather than transport, and then identifying the conditions of storage that would cover so much of the transport. The only thing you'd have to add on to transport is logistics and jiggling containers, stuff like that. But just the notion that going from A to Z, geolocation is just sort of a separate more general area of modeling that we wouldn't have to incorporate at all here. So then we just focus on the storage side of things as an offering.
If I could jump in. Sorry I'm late, everybody. What a great conversation. I'm sorry I missed the first half of it. So I agree with everything that Warren just said. And in essence, when food is transported, it's generally stored as well. You're not generally operating on it in another process. And storage absolutely is a process. There's no question. And there's all kinds of aspects of the environment in which something is being stored, which could occur inside of another environment, which could occur inside of another environment. So the storage has n number of layers that should be captured. And then that could be part of a transportation process. Something I just thought I would bring up that I didn't see in here, that is a process by objective that should probably be included, is adulteration. And now we tend to think that that's not a good process, but that doesn't, I think that we should tend to be agnostic about those things. So if you can alter olive oil with cheaper oil, if you can do something, those kinds of adulteration processes may include other sub-processes that don't have a value judgment, but I think adulteration as a process by objective should probably be in there, so that we can categorize when someone is doing something in contamination, maybe sort of the analog in the unintended, without an objective, but whereby something becomes changed as well. And these things can occur in a storage environment.
Right. So Matthew, you're bringing up something really broad, right? I mean, adulteration already has a certain connotation to it. Now, to olive oil, you may add another oil because you want to lower the smoking point. You might use a bleaching agent in drying fruits because you don't want it to discolor or turn into a darker shade. So adulteration has a connotation, and if you're staying away from connotations, then adulteration isn't the word to use. Now, if you're going to add something, because for a certain objective, like reduce the smoking point, or in case of transportation, inhibit sprouting of potatoes or, you know, garlic or whatever, then there would be, which we didn't get into, and you probably were late to the call, but we did, well, I anyway brought up the point that many things happen in storage. There is chemical changes, there is an addition of a chemical or lowering of temperatures. Now, all the same processes happen anyway. Therefore, storage is a good general term. As for doing all this multi-homing that we have done earlier, maybe that would be, if someone wanted to explore the use case of storage, then there are all these classes already that can be used. So going back to your first point about adulteration, I think that adulteration has a connotation. If I don't know if there was general agreement and such a term belonged here, then it would be at a much higher level. And the reason that you are modifying something exists anyway. It may not be thought of as adulteration. And the only reason, one of the reasons we start thinking that something is an adulteration is when you find that a certain process, like heating a certain oil, leads to the development of harmful chemicals later on.
Well, no, I'm talking about when, so from a food law point of view, a food has been adulterated when it is being intended to be marketed.
Matthew, let me pause you here. Is this a use case from food safety or a food law perspective? Because it's also quite important to think about the level of detail as related to the use case.
Yeah,
and
both.
Think about whether the process ontology is making any promises to address those use cases. So providing the vocabulary is one thing, but then addressing the use case is something else.
Right. So my point is that if you're going to do process by objective, then if you have an objective to adulterate a food, right, then
is that an objective? Do people start out saying, I want to adulterate this food?
People do. Yes, people absolutely do. Because they want to pass off something as being something that it is not. So you take something that is expensive, you add cheap ingredients to it, but you still claim that it has the expensive things in it. Does that make sense? So I can adulterate, I'll just go back to the olive oil example with cheaper oil. Now, maybe if I'm marketing it as a blended oil with a higher smoking point or a lower smoking point, whatever you want, then that's fine. But if I am intending to market this as first press extra virgin olive oil, when in fact it's not, then it's adulterated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, would these now
like Warren just put an example in there, honey being mixed with corn syrup, which is one of the most common ones.
Yeah, thanks for the examples, Matthew. I understand. I was trying to just think of why you would want this term. Now, is this something that would be, you would never see this. So this is in a way a hidden objective, because I mean, there are all sorts of efforts to cover that this is going on. So I'm just trying to see that if we did include this here, I mean, it could belong in at some higher level, and then the mechanism, the objectives it's connected to, the objective simply would be to provide something cheaper and sell it at an elevated price.
I guess my point for wanting to include it here is that if food on and the process ontology is going to be embraced by food investigation and enforcement branches of government, then they would want to have a way to model how something had been adulterated, and they would want to have some perhaps clues about ways things might be adulterated based on the ontological models that could be present.
Sure. I mean, you might mix things anyway. I mean, you might, in a baking recipe, you might have, honey
Sure.
and corn syrup anyway. So of course, the fact that you mix things together for a certain outcome, all that vocabulary will be here. And then if you want to use it for adulteration use cases, sure.
Yeah, I'll say I know the folks involved in blockchain who are trying to annotate the states of a food product as it goes along, are interested in the vocabulary to look at food adulteration, and this term is therefore can be a cross product against any one of the manipulations that we've got in this graph. So for that reason, I see it is a pretty high level term, and it is tied in there with objectives. So I totally see that we could squeeze it in and put it in as an objective of sorts. And then it just becomes more of a knowledge graph thing when people are actually attaching the word adulteration has occurred at some point to some food product using this vocabulary here. Okay, we are over time in our keenness to talk about all this stuff. Let's adjourn for a month. I'll try to make sure the next date is the correct one and not colliding with some of the other meetings we've got going. Let's see, there are just a couple of notes that I haven't looked at just yet. Let me just see. We have to put limits because it is very strange to model the way that you can make some fraudulent process. So what I'm thinking of there is that we can model what happened to a food, what is known about what happened to a food, and then also have a little bit of extra vocabulary to say nefarious agents were involved in this process. Right. And indeed, honey adulteration is a big thing apparently in Asia and some other markets. So in detecting that and putting a name on it is important. Okay, let's wrap it. Oh, one more message. Great discussion. Yes. Okay, good. I'll follow up. Please add to the agenda for next call. And it looks like we've been able to make some organizational decisions here. What is the objective of this project? Is it to have exhaustive vocabulary? We all walk into this with our own objectives. Mine is to slowly flesh out the top level terms. And then a secondary one to help somebody like Larissa create an upper level process ontology. And then thirdly, to actually list all of the food ontologies processes in food-on, except that goes beyond my knowledge graph. So I'm hoping that other people will actually vet these terms. And let's say I will add all of this, these definitions are a genesis for more precise definitions. I think a second pass on all of this would be carried out by people who are specifically in the process domain under that's under discussion, and they would be promoting the addition of the underlying food process terms into the ontology on a term by term basis. When it comes to actually defining a term, each term, it's kind of a rigorous process, or it can be, depending on how perfectionist one is in a particular domain. So perhaps in the general food ontology or biweekly call, we are actually getting to the point where we're now focusing on defining terms, curating particular terms. So it might be that we carry on adding specific food process terms through the curation group in particular, and leave it that this group is about structural and upper level organization. That's kind of what I would propose, but others may have difference. So please add to the agenda and intermediate questions out to the group. And until next month, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care, guys.
Okay,
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
bye. And there is a
Okay.
recording available, by the way, for everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all. Bye, folks.